Welcome and thank you for joining tonight's Beyond Sprawl Town Hall, a production of KJZZ's Fronteras Changing America Desk, the Public Insight Network. I'm Peter O'Dowd, KJZZ's news director and the moderator for tonight's program. Before we start, I'd like to thank Rio Salado College for hosting tonight's event, the staff at MCTV, which will rebroadcast this program. We'd also like to thank the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and APS for their financial support of the Fronteras Changing America Desk. And now for our distinguished panel of experts. Dr. Laddie Coor, former president of Arizona State University, and now the president and CEO of the Center for the Future of Arizona, an organization that focuses on issues critical to Arizona's quality of life as the state embarks upon its second century. Mr. Dave Richens, director of the Sun Corridor Legacy Program at the Sonoran Institute, a Tucson-based organization that focuses on sustainable growth in the western United States. Mr. Richens also serves on the Mesa City Council. Mayor Hugh Hallman, mayor in the city of Tempe since 2004, and a member of the Tempe City Council from 1998 to 2002. And Mark Stapp, executive director at the Master of Real Estate Development Program at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. Thank you for joining us. The first hour of our program will be a discussion with our panel and, when appropriate, with you in the audience. The second half will be interactive with the audience, focused directly on the audience. Be prepared to ask questions and offer your own ideas for discussion. A couple of house rules, please. Turn off your cell phones. When it's time for audience participation, please raise your hand. Wait for one of our facilitators to bring you a microphone. Then please stand, introduce yourself, and speak directly and clearly into the microphone. Given that we're broadcasters at KJZZ, I'd like to start this discussion of development, sustainability, economic growth, and regional identity with clips from KJZZ's Beyond Sprawl series, a reporting project from the Fronteras Changing America Desk that will provide, I hope, fodder for tonight's discussion.
Out here on the westernmost edge of Phoenix, it's easy to find vast swatches of empty land, once prepped for 2x4s and work crews.
It's tragic. It's heartbreaking.
Over the years, realtor Greg Swan has watched this neighborhood boom and then bust.
It was as if a slow fire had started to destroy neighborhoods. It burned in a ring from the outskirts of Phoenix in toward the center. Neighborhoods of empty houses with grass and weeds as tall as a man, dead trees, broken windows, piled up newspapers.
To Warman, the houses on this street, about 2,500 square feet, are way too big for just one or two people.
I mean, 2,500 square feet, you gotta clean that. That's a lot of cleaning.
Not to mention
air conditioning and heating and water.
Biotech is one of the few industries to have survived the economic downturn relatively well. During the first year of the recession, while other private sectors were shedding employees daily, the industry actually added jobs.
I mean, in the last boom, we were still doing C's. We had call centers, chip plants, and construction.
But now Shea is no longer just thinking about cubicle density. He's thinking about urban density.
It turns out that the same principles that worked for improving company culture actually work for driving productivity and innovation in a city.
For this series, we operated under the impression that single-family home construction has been perhaps the most powerful engine of economic growth for much of the Southwest since World War II. Arizona was once a leader in job growth, but if you paid attention at all to the news, you know a recession has decimated the housing and construction industries that once defined our identity. Some economists predict housing and construction may never rebound to provide the kind of jobs and economic vitality the region is accustomed to. Others say it's just a matter of time until the market recovers, and that it's actually in the process of recovering right now. Then there are the demographic changes that could permanently alter the face of our communities, both in our cities and in our suburbs. In our series, we investigated the past and the present to report on what growth in the Southwest could look like in the future. What better time than now, in the first month of 2012, our state centennial, to continue that discussion. At a time when there's a glimmer of light at the end of a long, difficult road, what will we decide to do? Will it be business as usual, or will we re-envision something different? There is much to talk about. A new, robust economy will undoubtedly require strong leaders in higher education. I'd like to call on Maricopa County Community College District Chancellor Dr. Rufus Glasper to answer the night's first question. What role will the education system, and specifically community colleges, have in re-envisioning the Southwest's economy? Dr. Glasper.
Thank you for the opportunity, Peter. The Maricopa Community Colleges will play a significant role in terms of putting individuals back to work. That's our job. Many of you are aware of the statistics, and let me just throw out a few and then talk about what we're doing about it. 2006 was the peak year for construction. And you look at 2011, we had 142,000 jobs at that particular point in time. We lost from 2006 to 2011, 142,000 jobs. 7,300 of those jobs have been regained as of November 11th of last year. As we're looking right now, as was mentioned, we don't believe many of those jobs will come back. Our colleges have been working diligently to look at displaced workers and invite them into our colleges, and we have individual counseling. We're talking to them about broadening their skill base, learning to work on computers and learning other types of skills that will allow them to move into different industries. Some of those industries are in HVAC, and one of the more sprawling ones right now is solar industry. We're looking at solar industry, energy. We're working with APS and SRP now, trying to help them. They will lose about 10% of their workers over the next 4 to 5 years. And we believe that in terms of energy transmission and generation, we can work with displaced workers out of the construction industry and others to give them new skill sets. But in order to move to these new skill sets, that's why we're trying to look at broadening their skills in terms of the computer-based skills and other types of applications. So our role right now is to try to be there to help them become a more well-rounded individual as they look for jobs within the future. And then if the construction jobs come back, then they'll have other skill sets to fall back on. But we believe that we have a major role, and all of our colleges are involved in this evolution right now.
Thank you, Dr. Glasper. Now, Rio Salado College President Dr. Chris Bustamante. Dr. Bustamante will tell us how Rio is educating people who are out of work and helping them transition into new careers.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Just to give you a sense of the demand for our services here at Rio Salado College, we educate 70,000 students a year in this college alone, and 43,000 of the students are pursuing their college studies online. Last year, we educated 7,000 more students than we did the year before. Give you a sense of the great demand for our services. And many of the top programs that people are really seeking relative to recareering and retraining in are in business, computer technology, healthcare, paralegal services, teacher education, and early childhood education. Also, to give you a sense of the demographic of our student, the average age is 29 years of age. 84% of our students are attending college part-time. That means that they are fully employed or part-time employed and juggling a family as well. And so they're seeking our services for that purpose. Community colleges and Rio Salado College in general are really pivotal and have proven pivotal to an economic growth or recovery strategy as a result of the thousands of students. The Maricopa system alone educates 270,000 students a year to recareer and retrain people annually, and we're very fortunate that this community has invested well in its community college system to be able to position us well to serve our community, especially in this down economic time through these workforce training and academic programs. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bustamante. And I also want to keep this issue of education in mind tonight, and I welcome both of your input as we move forward. I'm sure the topic of education will return. So let's get to it. Urban sprawl. We're famous for it. For generations, developers and homeowners have gotten rich expanding the edges of Phoenix, and now we're paying for it. In hindsight, Laddie Core, first question to you. Is it fair to say that generations of developers and homeowners made a fundamental mistake?
I think it's fair to say that we all made a mistake in not learning our lessons from what had become a regular cycle of boom and bust, beginning with the Second World War. There's always been in Arizona's history moments of stronger and weaker periods, but with the really quite remarkable growth of Arizona, not only with the military bases that came here in the Second World War, but with the ancillary activities that surrounded them, companies and the embryonic part of our electronics industry that came from it, we had a good deal of building that it continued to expand right after the Second World War when the GIs came home, and then the first of our major busts. I think one of the major questions we have to ask now is I hope we take advantage of this very painful pause we have, is what lessons we have learned and what incentives we can at least create that are positive and recognize that the negative incentives, the incentives that continue to drive sprawl, should be dampened a bit. In the late 80s, early 90s, when I came to ASU, we had one of those big, deep troughs, and yet some of the great current fortunes in Arizona have been made since that time, with RTC converting properties and properties themselves leading to an incentive to build and grow, along now with the recent spate of easy credit that led to the housing boom. So the developers, that's a natural part of the life. That's what their task is, and they have performed it basically very well. Low-cost housing in the early stages that gave us a very attractive economy. But all of us have a responsibility for saying, wait a minute, that's not enough. If you're just built on growth, if it's just housing as the centerpiece of the economy, if you don't diversify it and begin building a greater array of jobs in terms of income, you're going to have this decline again in the future. It is not inevitable. There have been other regions of the country early in their life that have had the same kind of cyclical activity that we've seen here in Phoenix. But it does take conscious, clear agreement about the kind of future we want to keep it from happening again.
Dave Richards, it has kind of crept into our culture, hasn't it? This culture of growth. In fact, I was talking to a realtor for this series who we were standing out in one of these half-built subdivisions, and he says, you know, in 5 years, in 2 years, in 3 years, there's going to be houses here. In fact, there's not just going to be houses here, there's going to be houses way out there where they meant to build them the last time. When you hear Dr. Core say things about lessons learned and incentive to dampen sprawl, is this something that we can get out of is this something that we can change about our culture?
I think it is, and I don't know that it's going to be a cultural change that makes it happen, but it's going to be a demographic change that's going to happen. By 2030, people are predicting about 73% of households will not have children in them. And the way people are going to live is going to be fundamentally different. You have this huge baby boomer curve, and so is that single-family home product meeting the need of the market in 20 years? And so I think there's a lot of these sprawling, we call them zombie subdivisions at the Sonoran Institute, that some of them just aren't going to work, and they're never going to work, no matter how much you dream that they are. You have a terrible combination of long commutes and expensive gas prices and changing demographics and families that I think are really going to dampen the desire. Now, can that be mitigated for? Maybe a little bit, but that depends on the decisions we make as a community as far as transportation connectivity and how that all works. Maybe you get a train that helps connect some of that stuff, and where some of your economic development decisions help place industry. But so I think there's some things that we can do to mitigate for it. But the best thing is you think if Arizona is truly going to have 10 or 11 million people by 2040, where are those people going to be? Are they going to be on the edge, or are they going to be in town? If you look at it that way, 33% of the buildings we're going to need for this growth of Arizona don't exist yet. So where we decide to build those buildings is important, and we have to recognize the cultural and demographic shift that's driving where we put those buildings.
Mark Stapp, what do you think about that? I mean, cultural, demographic shifts, that affects the way we build houses?
It's going to affect how we build houses. I think to the degree that they may be designed differently. I think we've got some fundamental issues in the metropolitan area that impact growth patterns here. This a little bit goes to the mayor, and he can speak from a political perspective, but we lack a substantial metropolitan growth plan. I mean, we've got all of these municipalities, these individual governments that are vying for pieces of the economic development pie. And there's a lack of strong coordination about development policies that help shape the patterns. So we've got investments in certain communities. I think the city of Tempe, Mesa, and Phoenix have been working very nicely together, but there's a lot of property available, and we have very strong personal property rights in the state. So people have the right to go do certain things with their land. And when you've got public policy that supports that from competing communities, you're going to continue to see some of these, whether they make economic sense completely or not, you only know in retrospect. And that's a lot of what's happened in this time around, is only in retrospect did we realize it wasn't working. They were working at the moment that someone decided to do it, at least in their mind. Developers are intermediaries in an economic development process. That's all they are, okay? The unfortunate thing is it's not civic leaders who build communities. It's not community colleges, it's not universities, it's not planning and zoning commissions or city councils. It's developers that actually build communities. It's the public policies that shape what they do and how they do it. And when we don't have strong, coordinated public policy in the metropolitan area, we're going to continue to have the potential for these problems.
I want to have an entire section on public policy here coming up in just a minute, and I think this is a good time to turn to Mayor Holman. In your 2011 State of the City address, you went as far to say that some have relied on this Ponzi scheme of growth by sprawl, I think is using your words. And you come from a landlocked city, right? You can't grow in some of the same ways that some of the cities on the fringe have. Does that color your perspective, your city's perspective on how to grow and which direction you'll grow?
In the pejorative, you could say it colors my vision, or you could understand that it actually informs my view of the world. And I'd start by saying your introduction talking about generations of mistakes actually is, I think, wrong. The official position of most of the leadership in this state through the 1950s, immediately post-war, was that we should work to develop independent villages that would support themselves with economic development, that would have commercial and industrial bases that would support the residents that would live within that community, and that we should connect those communities carefully for the certain amenities that one wants to build in a community where you really can only justify one or a few of them, sort of a collective action problem. The Pulliam family's position in the Arizona Republic was continued through the early 1970s to oppose the development of freeways that would lead to sprawl. They made the argument, and I think they were prescient in doing so, that in creating freeways, one was going to assure sprawl and assure greater congestion. That if you look at economic models, people, and certainly if you look at this county as an example, the moment a concept of a freeway is announced through the official bodies, in this case the Maricopa Association of Governments, it's announced as to exactly where a freeway is going to go. You see massive speculation in the real estate go on, and then lots of stick-built, single-family units built farther and farther out into the sprawl areas. That didn't occur in the 1940s. It didn't occur in the 1930s. It didn't occur in the 1950s. It occurred as we began to change the policies in this state that understood that we have private rights in land, but then incentivized the maximum sprawl effect by assuring that we would develop freeways as fast as anybody wanted to. To suggest that developers are intermediaries in the development process, I think, is correct, except that they play a significant role in the politics of state government. So if you want to find out who's got the most powerful lobbyists go down the real estate list. Look who's developing land and see who they've hired as real estate lobbyists to make sure that the government property lease excise tax exists in this state and that governments use it to expand their territories and ultimately use it for development, that we have still not stopped the giveaway of tax revenues to support subsidies for development, and worse, that we allow a developer to build something like Anthem under the guise that it's the private rights of developers to do that, and then concede taxpayer money, not at the expense of the people who decided they wanted a different lifestyle and live out in the hinterlands and commute into Phoenix for their jobs. They can do that. But please don't turn around and demand that this entire community develop massive freeways to support your choice of lifestyle, polluting the air and taking very vital resources from other important areas. Now that makes me politically unelectable, because the people in this state, in this county, want to see flat land continue to be developed with stick-built houses. And that's nuts. So my perspective is colored from my view of being in one of the oldest cities in this state, being in the middle of this valley, and recognizing that the competition I'm dealing against are heavily subsidizing the expansion and the sprawl of housing. While I am attacked regularly for saying that if you're going to build transportation, you must look at fairly all transportation solutions, and that, I'm afraid to say, Mr. Miller, includes mass transit once you recognize that we're subsidizing automobiles. Trains and other railed vehicles do require a subsidy, that's right, but so do automobiles. And we've been subsidizing automobiles for a century, and now what we're getting is we're turning this beautiful valley into Los Angeles with the massive congestion and pollution and the sprawl that destroys the very desert that brought most of us here in the first place.
Ladikor, what do you think about that? I mean, part of your organization kind of takes the temperature of Arizona and what they want and what the public is looking for. Does the lifestyle they're living now meet what they were looking for?
One of the most powerful tools of the Gallup Arizona poll our center conducted was to ask Arizonans, what are the things you treasure most? And hands down, by a substantial margin, if you look at the chart on which these things appear, is the environment, the outdoor experience, and easy access for recreation in those areas. Absolutely hands down. I believe that's where a good deal of the support for the beleaguered growing smarter cycles that we had, where it kept being tugged and hawed in the legislature as the policy was put together. Remember the headlines? It's easy to forget them when we're in a down cycle. An acre an hour being consumed as the development took place. And the expression, at least, and that's where we have the really, I think, interesting set of questions between practice, policy, and what the expression of hopes are, is that this environment, the outdoors, is the single most important asset that people see. Now, they also express it in a very interesting way in terms of the access to outdoor spaces in the urban areas. So reference, for example, to the mountain preserves and to the other areas that are here. But it is a very strong expression of a value.
Well, the freeways that Mayor Hallman were talking about are here. We're talking about building more freeways. But I wonder if there's this opportunity now to rethink things. Are there viable new models for development in a post-recovery economy that don't involve thinking the old way? And I'll open that up to anybody.
Yes. The answer is yes, and sorry to hog the microphone, gentlemen, but I've got another hour's worth of notes here, so I'm not sure how you're going to get in. Here's how we ended up, I think, where we are. When people talk about, and it's a cute soundbite, the 3 C's, call centers, chip plants, and construction, a famous voice saying that, but of course those are very different things. Construction is not, in my view, ever been a driver of our economy. It's not a leading indicator, it's a lagging indicator. And it's when other things begin to happen that we have to build strip malls, we build houses, we build commercial and industrial plants, when demand starts seeking those, and the problem is it's slow to stop. This last cycle was unique because it was the cocktail party effect. We saw the same thing occur in Silicon Valley when everybody at cocktail parties would talk about how much they'd invested in some new company, and everybody was trading stocks back and forth at cocktail parties. Here it was, gee, I bought an extra house because I'm going to rent it to somebody, and people started trading new houses that they had no intention of living in, and the developers underlying that had no idea that the demand that they were seeing was this phantom demand for the idea that everybody was going to own a second house that they were going to rent to somebody else. Then throw on the effects of Senate Bill 1070 that chased a whole bunch of people who otherwise would have been tenants, whether you like it or not. That's true. We had a lot of people leave the state, and as a result, that net loss of population eliminated a whole bunch of folks who would have been tenants in multifamily or single-family housing. The new model, I think, is, as Mr. Richens pointed out, is going to be driven by economic demand, and the demographics are a-changing. And so those people who are currently in development and think they're going to do the same old thing and bulldoze some more acreage and build up some stick houses and put people in automobiles to commute are kidding themselves. The changing demographic is driving us back toward the kinds of models we've seen for a couple of centuries, where people find the quality of life of living in an urban environment that has a theater, has a symphony, has an art gallery, has parks, has opportunities to be part of a community. In this state, you don't have to be part of the old community to be actively involved in the community. I'm an example of that. My family's both been here since the 1860s, and I'm the kid who should never have been elected to office in Tempe because I grew up north of the river, and that's not really Tempe. You can get into this community even if you're new to it. But the model you're going to see is urban. It's going to be supported by the amenities Dr. Kaur talked about. That's the reason for my focus on Papago Park, one of the unique recreational amenities in the country, and that will draw people to the center. As an example of the model, the two Center Point towers that went into bankruptcy not because the project was bad, but because the lender went into bankruptcy and the project couldn't be completed, had 364 units, which is the equivalent number of single-family homes that you would have to put on a quarter section of land, 160 acres. You'd have had to have paved 2 miles of asphalt. You'd have had to have built 4 miles of sidewalks, water lines and sewer lines, watered all the lawns that go with that. That's the different model you're going to see. Those buildings are now full, and people want that kind of product in an urban environment, and I'll stop there before you shoot me.
I wasn't going to shoot you. Mark Stapp, is that the way it's going to work, though? I mean, we were talking before this started. Isn't it just going to, the exact same thing's going to happen as soon as the market recovers, isn't it?
Well, you know, we talk about the market as though it's a singular thing, and it's not, okay? The market is actually many different things. And one of the primary drivers to the overall market is, I think as the mayor would point out, it's the financial buyer of these products. And one of the things that happened to this country from the mid-1990s until most recently was the fact that the financial buyer converted the real estate, which is a fixed, unique asset, into a fungible, tradable asset. And they realized that by doing that, they could make a lot of money by trading it. And they needed lots of product. And so what happened is you created this disconnect between a local place and how things get financed, and you converted it into this global marketplace totally disconnected with local decision making.
And then subsidized it with federal government guarantees.
Absolutely. And then also all sorts of other things on top of that that said, hey, you know what? Here's your insurance, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, so that you lender, even though you made a bad fundamental decision because you did no underwriting on this, you still have insurance. The reason you can't fix the problem as easily as we think we should be able to with the foreclosure process has nothing to do with the bank. It has to do with the investors and the fact that those investors get insurance. They're not motivated to take a principal reduction, okay? You can't fix the problem until you fix the other institutional drivers to decision making. Developers do what they do because that's what the money wants. So one of the things that I would like to see the state do is pursue the idea of a state bank. North Dakota has one. It's worked exceedingly well for them. And the reason for doing it is to be able to control financial institutions' decision-making around our own community economic development principles so that we can get some of the things done that the mayor was talking about. This is not going to be either or, okay? We had some terrific public policy decision-making to build the light rail, to put the university in downtown Phoenix, okay? If we hadn't have done those two things, imagine how beleaguered this economy, this community would be over the last 4 or 5 years, okay? They've been very positive. Now we need policy and we need institutional support that helps us drive development towards that. We're not going to get rid of development on the edge. It's not going away, okay? It's going to continue to be that way. I think the idea is, can we do it smarter? Can we slow the pace? Can we provide more alternative solutions? This is a very young community.
Dave Richens, why don't you step in there? Models for future growth. I think that fits right into your
I thought it was interesting, your original, you said without returning to the old way. And I think a lot of it is, I'm going to echo Mayor Hallman a little bit, it's not only not thinking about it the old way, but it's thinking about it the older way. If you look at how communities developed back in the 20s and 30s in these neighborhood intensive designs with front porches and different things, that's the product that I think people are starting to want. And there's a lot of opportunity for infill here. And you know, as Mark put, there's going to need to be a little bit of edge development, but there's also a lot of opportunity for infill development because the generation that are buying homes now, or the baby boomers also, they're wanting the amenities exactly as Mayor Hallman described. That's what our constituents in Mesa are speaking out for. We're getting a lot of support for that kind of thing now. It's not just an austere community that has transportation and public safety. Transportation and public safety is not a community. Developers don't build communities, they build buildings. It's policymakers and neighbors and the people who interact in that community are the ones who actually build community. They're the ones so it's using it kind of two different senses of the word, you know.
Let me interject for one moment because, you know, we use the term developer categorically, okay, and they're not all created equally. I think some view this with purely pecuniary self-interest, all right? And part of what we have to do is continually push developers to have to view things and perform at a higher standard, okay? That you can do things that what I would call are benignly correct. A lot of the development that occurred, the vast majority of it that occurred on the periphery, was benignly correct. They had the right to do it, they had the public support to do it, they did it, and they made a lot of money.
People were buying the houses.
The people were buying the houses, exactly. So what doesn't mean that you had to take the pattern that they were taking. And so should we be looking at how we build, if we are going to build on the edge, different? Okay, what do we do with homeowners associations? Okay, can homeowners associations where you don't have communities that have social support systems function in a way different than simply being a regulatory entity? You know, can they act to create a fabric which creates community by fostering it from the very beginning? Only I've done that in communities where I've got 11,000 people living in them by bringing in other organizations like the YMCA from the very beginning that says, you know what, we're going to create a social system in here. We're not going to build just a giant subdivision.
I want to open it up, if I can, to the audience. I know there's a lot of experts out there who are either in architecture or in planning. New models for different kinds of growth. Anyone have any thoughts? Yes, sir. If you can wait for the microphone, please.
Yes, this region is blessed with a geographic pattern of 1 square mile, a 1 square mile division. Those square miles are sufficient size to create viable neighborhoods which have as their centers elementary schools and services for the local people that live around them, have the opportunity to provide a diverse choice of housing, townhouses, apartments, single family, the way we see it in our sprawl, and larger homes. And all this within a half a mile of the elementary school, a walkable distance. One who lives in such a community could surrender the automobile for the 50% of trips that are made that are at a neighborhood scale. That's a huge savings in the ecology. It's a huge benefit to the health of the people that live in the community. And it provides sustainability in the community because with a variety of housing, you have people coming in at the bottom, affordable housing, if you will, as their family needs change and their families expand and they increase their income, they're able to move up into other houses within the community that they probably value. As Dr. Kaur's survey has shown, that community identity is one of the prime values that people have in the environment that they live in.
Dr. Kaur, community identity, is this something that we can improve upon, that we failed upon in the past? And I think you have looked into that, haven't you?
A very interesting experiment, and I see several in the room here who participated, that the Urban Land Institute did with Legos a couple of years ago. I think is one of the more interesting way that question is being answered kind of conceptually by Arizonans. In essence, the task was with teams of 6 or 8 people around tables in this vast convention center downtown to design the kind of future that you would like for the metropolitan area. And while there was great variation in detail, almost to a proposal were nodes of community connected to one another by freeways in some instances, but increasingly along the rail lines that would have public transportation, where the very thing this gentleman just described was at the heart of it. So when people got up to describe it, they wanted to be close to where they worked, where they played, where their children were, and they wanted to do it in a way where there was an identity they could feel in that community, even as part of a larger urban development. Indeed, the Arizona We Want study reaffirmed that sense of community. Love the place, but don't feel very connected to it, and a desire to have something done about it. Now, there's an interesting piece of work about the economics of where one lives and what one pays, where it took the 30 major metropolitan areas in America, Phoenix was a part of that obviously, and added the cost of transportation with the cost of housing. And it is virtually constant across the nation. So the cost of housing in New York and San Francisco is very high. The cost of transportation is very low because people live there, they have access to public transportation. In sprawl cities and spread out cities and communities like Houston and Phoenix and the inland empire of California, where housing costs are lower, the cost of transportation is much higher. Cost of transportation, unless it is augmented by a substantial kind of corridor of public transportation, is only going to get higher, no matter how quickly alternative energy comes along.
Right, and we're so set in our ways. I mean, how can we realistically say that we can lower the costs of our transportation successfully, not build the freeways that Mayor Holman is talking about? That's so pie in the sky.
Well, we ought to try it. The skeptics said it wouldn't work with a light rail from Mesa through Phoenix and look at the ridership there. And the skeptics have said, well, these other rail lines are difficult to access, and they probably won't serve as a connector. I think there's evidence that would suggest to the contrary.
Well, but the point our moderator made is, and tied into Dr. Kaur's point, is that that cost demonstrates a subsidy of one form or another. The cost of transportation is subsidized in one way or one form or another, and that's what we're dealing with here, and nobody wants to recognize the elephant in the room. The transportation infrastructure that a community builds is what then helps determine what that community looks like. And so I wouldn't join you perhaps in a state bank that would control the decision making. I tend to want those decisions to be made based on people's choices of what they want, but we are kidding ourselves if we think we're not already incentivizing different decisions than the community really would like at this stage. The sprawl was heavily incentivized. That's why we got what we got. Developers were part of that process. Very famous names with loud voices talk about green economies now, but were intimately involved with the sprawl that occurred. We have a different economy now, and this is our chance to eliminate the subsidies that are cutting our own future off at the knees. We're going to lose the community we have. Now, there are developers who do and have in the past built communities. Del Webb built an entire community for folks who wanted to retire, put in the swimming pools and all the infrastructure that they figured out folks in that demographic wanted. Now they want something different if you're aged and you don't want to go out to the place to die, but you want to be part of the community and be part of that. Well, what this gentleman just pointed out is the model that actually goes, as Mr. Richens said, back to the ancient past. The city of Tempe is built on an entire model across its 42.5 square miles of 1 square mile. Every single residential neighborhood has a neighborhood park built in it by the city, with a school associated with that park that then added that infrastructure. There's a reason Tempe continues the way it does. Now, did we get competed against effectively as sprawl was subsidized and people saw the new freeways being out in the built out into the Far East? Yes, we had a hard time. Our community's housing stock suffered in the price ranges, but that meant some housing was cheaper for folks who saw the value of reinvesting in older stock that was built out of block, not out of stick, that things that have been here for 100 years, those kinds of things happen. So that neighborhood model exists. It's existed for centuries. That's what makes Tempe sustainable at this stage. But our fight is to make sure that as this community now recognizes sprawl can be very damaging, that we recognize that together, that this is not a fight against the east side of Mesa or the west end of Glendale or Goodyear, but that they've got to recognize that they not follow the model that I'm afraid Mesa did for 20 years, and Mr. Richens is helping to stop. And that was those same said developers going out to that village model that was originally created and rezoning commercial and industrial properties from their use to support the neighborhoods that were already in Mesa with businesses that would support those residents and turned it instead into more tracts of stick houses. That's a mistake. And we ought to be making sure that every one of these communities, given its current population, starts pushing to get development of industrial and commercial bases there. And now with the electronics like Mr. Richens has here, many, many people can work from home and they can then live in the kind of community that they want to live in, and we don't need to keep subsidizing the sprawl and instead protect what we've got here before it's gone.
You know, the subsidy that talks about, I mean, when impact fees happened, you fundamentally changed the conversation because developers were now coming in saying, hey, our growth is going to pay for itself. We'll extend the water line, we'll extend the road, we'll extend the power to our development. So our development's paying for itself. You know, whereas earlier, before impact fees existed, cities grew when they could afford to grow, when they had the economic justification to continue to grow. But
let's
impact
remind people what impact fees are. Impact fees are the fees that the developers pay, basically per house, for the infrastructure that those new communities are bringing.
Which typically are only the average cost, not the marginal cost of growth. And that's why we get stung. The average cost is much lower than the marginal cost as you expand the community to the edges. That extra mile of water line, that extra mile of sewer line, that extra mile of roadway is more expensive to the infrastructure than the stuff that's close in. And if you want to figure out what those numbers look like, look at the average cost of services for those items within the cities. Those that are more compact are able to reduce their cost to their residents, and those that have, through the Ponzi scheme of growth, as you quoted from my State of the City speech, I've actually used it twice, it has happened. The best thing that ever happened to the city of Tempe is that city to the south of us, in the dark of night in the early 1970s, snuck in and annexed across our southern border all the way to Ahwatukee, and suddenly Tempe was cut off. And as a result, we had to plan for the last 40 years to make sure we were ready for that stagnation period, that we could continue to renew what we've had. And the worst thing that happens to cities is when their elected officials decide that they're going to expand and they annex bigger and bigger tracts of land. That is the death to community. It destroys the sense of community, and there are cities around Tempe that have done that, and they no longer have their soul. They've lost their soul because their entire sense of community has been wiped out by that government action.
Well, let us talk about public policy here, and let us, at the expense of boring people to death with this concept of impact fees.
I'm afraid you're too late.
I think it's really important. Impact fees specifically. The legislature just passed a bill recently that changed the way that we use impact fees. That in fact limits what impact fees are used for, and arguably puts more burden on the taxpayer. Is this a good law? Is this the legislature encouraging the development the way we used to see it?
Absolutely, and that was a carefully crafted effort, compromise, that prevented it from being even worse. It would have been even worse to taxpayers had one side won entirely, but because there was sufficient assistance from municipal leadership to say that would not be acceptable, we had enough sway to get a compromise that protected taxpayers and prevented sprawl to an even greater extent.
Critics of the impact fee bill say that it may be just another developer-friendly law that's a handout for an industry that got us into trouble in the first place. Mr. Stapp, what do you think?
Growth has an expense. There's no doubt about it. I mean, many of the issues that we're talking about, the models that we're talking about, we've known about for a long time. Okay. When I was in school in the late 1970s in my undergraduate degree, we knew these principles. There's nothing new here. There's nothing new that we're talking about. Okay, so why are we sitting here talking about it if it's nothing new? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, one, it's not easy to figure out. Okay, this is not a static situation. It's a very fluid environment. Okay, so communities age. They have life cycles. We recognize those things, all right? And people, their values change, their wants and their needs change. And it changes relative to the life cycle of those neighborhoods as well. So we've got this very, very mobile community. It's not so easy to say, hey, we're going to build this neighborhood and people will just live there forever. That's not going to happen. People change jobs, people move.
Tastes change.
They change, okay? So I think I'm going to answer your question here in a minute, Peter. I'm getting there, okay? So why hasn't this worked? It hasn't worked because we continually change public policy, okay, to suit special interest groups, okay? Rather than having a community development or a metropolitan development policy that sticks to creating the right kinds of physical spaces, because that's the basic network that we're going to have to build on and rebuild on in this mobile environment.
To steal a line, great communities aren't the buildings within them, it's the spaces between the buildings.
Exactly. And so rather than sticking with public policy that supports that, we are continually evolving and changing for special interest groups. And I think that piece of legislation was just that.
So, because, I mean, big picture, that's a small example. What I want to know is the state legislature, are public policy makers helping us get out of this? Or are they just making it worse? Hey, Laddie Coor, do you have an opinion?
I don't think we have a very good bond between our elected officials at the legislature and our citizens. So I start with that. To me, that was one of the most powerful things that came out of our Gallup Arizona poll. Listen to this figure. Not only did only 10% of the Arizonans, statistically valid study of the entire state's population, not only did 10% think that their elected officials were not doing a good job, but only 10% thought their elected officials even represented their interest, or conversely, that did not represent their interest. So I will approach the question with that skepticism, that there is a set of views in the populace that are not being perfectly represented in the legislative process. I know less about the dynamics of the lobby in this arena than Mayor Hallman and the others who deal with it on a regular basis. But my suspicion would be, based on what we've seen in our work, is that there is not the strong citizen voice that we see reflected when you do plans like the one I mentioned a moment ago, the Urban Land Institute, and other very constructive activities of that kind to have them get translated into policy.
We're going to take a break here in just a minute. Dave Richens, I want to ask you, give me an example, if you could. Innovative public policy that can move us beyond our old models. Do you have one?
Well, I think some of the things we can do. That's a really good question. I'd love some time to think about that a little bit. But
you think about the Sun Corridor, though, and what would need to happen to make sure growth is smart in that corridor between Phoenix and Tucson, for example.
State land reform. I mean, that would be the one I'd go to. That's probably an easy go-to, is state land reform, because you have vast tracts of state land that are very suitable for conservation and Arizona value, as articulated by the folks in the Gallup study. And you've had state land being some of the land that comes to the market the slowest. And so the private tracts that are beyond the state land get leaped to the next development, to the next development, and then the state land becomes backfill or infill. And because we don't have the ability to sell state land except for at auction, it's kind of put a constraining factor in the way that we deal with this trust. Some people think state land is public land. It is not public land. It is private land owned by the state, and it's held in trust for our school kids to be able to finance education. And I don't know that we always use that asset in a way that's successful. And to me, I think that is a real low-hanging fruit. The citizens of Arizona have really struggled with the concept of anything from land exchanges or any other kind of reforms to how we deal with 9.2 million acres. That's a lot of land.
Land department reform, state trust land reform, is really tough because it's not just up to us. There's a congressional mandate. The one thing that I think this legislature could do that doesn't require any change of the law is to better fund the land department.
Oh, yeah.
The land department
or at least fund it.
At least fund it, exactly, Laddie. Okay, when you consider the fact that they manage, that land commissioner manages one of the largest land trusts in the world, okay? And when you consider the fact that she doesn't have the budget to hire the financial analysts, the strategists, the things that other trusts would have at its disposal for decision making is absolutely crazy. That alone would make a giant difference in her ability, the land commissioner's ability, to make better decisions about what's good for the trust. She doesn't know what her opportunity costs are. She doesn't have the ability to study it.
Let's keep this idea in mind. And I've been a remiss moderator because we have not talked about new economies, something I really want to get into. Ideas for new ways to grow. This does bring us to the end of the first half of our program. After a short break, we'll be right back.
Experience the Maricopa Community Colleges on Maricopa Now. From educational and inspirational to just plain fun. We'll take you on adventures with students and faculty, show you how to reduce your carbon footprint, and teach you how to make a new favorite dish. Maricopa Now will introduce you to the people, places, and programs that make the Maricopa Colleges unique. Maricopa Now can be seen every day on MCTV, Cox Cable, Channel 115.
The second half of this presentation belongs to you. In the audience, we have architects, we have planners, we have academics, we have real estate agents and conservationists. What questions do you have that have been unanswered? What new economies will bring us out of this downturn? What new ideas do you have? I open the floor now. Please raise your hand. Please give your name. Please give your affiliation. Please speak clearly into the microphone. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Mike Branham, City of Tempe. Considering the state's libertarian leanings, do you think trying to, find a way out of this, is going to get pushback? You try and get people out of their cars and they accuse you of social engineering, and there is resistance.
I think we have an example to the north, Utah, very similar basic values in terms of small central government, limited reach, considerable responsibility placed at the local level. If you follow the work of Envision Utah, a project put together now almost 20 years ago in its inception, public, private, had a couple of fits and starts as they tried to work out what they were trying to do, and realized it does not cover the entire state. It covers 80% of the state, which is what our Sun Corridor is in Arizona, the Front Range of the Wasatch. They realized there were urban problems along that area, their own version of sprawl, where there's much less available land on that Front Range with Salt Lake and other settings than we have here. And they began a process which is a very interesting iteration of education and engagement at each local community, the development of tools by which those local communities start making decisions, and ways in which those decisions then get fed into the larger stream of things, so that ultimately you have, for example, a light rail system along the entire range, Front Range. You have extraordinarily ingenious use of federal dollars that came as part of the repositioning, reconfiguration of the two major interstates that cross in order to have everything ready for the Winter Olympics, something that the citizens there had gone out and captured. In short, it is a model that kept the values that I think have been part of that state for many years and accomplished some very thoughtful, ongoing decisions about how to organize themselves. So whatever leanings we have, my best judgment, personal, I can't cite the data that we've been working with definitively to reach it, is that Arizona is not at the fringes, that Arizona is basically a moderate center-right state, and there are within those parameters, I think, a substantial measure of willingness to think in collaborative ways that could lead to an Arizona version of a similar outcome.
Dave Richardson. Making decisions, policy decisions on values instead of just pure politics is a good start, and that's what Envision, the magic of Envision Utah was that it really tapped into people's values. They valued spending more time with their families. They valued safety. They valued some fundamental things that, oh yeah, of course, it's almost intuitive, but they started making policy choices based on that. If they value family, then they want to get home from their job sooner, and if they want to get home from their job sooner, they'll do things that decrease sprawl, because they don't want to commute so long. They don't want to spend so much time on the road. And so they started making policy decisions based on that, and that's what led to 7 consecutive votes to put in public transit expansions from light rail to commuter rail. I think a lot of it in Arizona comes down to choices now. And I mean that in a way that, there's nothing more fundamental in America with this. We love to have choice here. And we lack choice. If I want to take a bus to work, it's tough. I have to make several transfers, and it takes me an hour and a half to get there, and if I drive my car, it's a half an hour. Well, those are some choices that we've made there. But we lack a housing product type other than single-family homes in great number. My choices are limited to single-family homes at the end of the freeway, out on the edge of town. I just don't have a lot of other choices. I live in West Mesa, which is, to me, it's 10 minutes from downtown everywhere. I made a choice. It's a 1962 home. I like it, but it's a single-family home. I have 4 kids. I can't choose a high-rise condo. But, You know, if I was able to afford a cabin in the mountains or a condo in a downtown, I would take a condo in a downtown because my tastes are that way. And I think by generations, tastes are changing in that way too. I like the action. I like to be where stuff is going on. And we just lack that housing type. My assistant's mother just moved here from Oklahoma, and she wanted to live in downtown Mesa. We had nothing for her from a housing standpoint. So if there's any developers in the room, we have a new light rail line coming into downtown Mesa. We have a great art center, a great library, great cultural offerings, but we lack housing in our downtown. The type that is walkable and that's been described by this gentleman over here and Mark and others. If you want a single-family home, you can find those in spades. But we need to really add to our stable of choices in Arizona.
The question was, though, is there going to be pushback from pushing to end sprawl? And the real issue is politically, is there a pushback from ending the subsidies that incentivize?
To answer the question you want.
I understood. No. But I'm bringing it back to the question that was asked only because it was helpful to me, and that is the pushback comes from trying to end the very subsidies that we're supplying through our government choice sets, both at the municipal and at the state level and at the federal level. There were massive amounts of federal dollars given to Salt Lake and the state of Utah in order to create the results they've gotten. That doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. One has to peel back the questions, but somebody made the point during the break that, for example, Houston is a terrific model of liberty, and yet it was Houston that just received a $900 million grant from the federal government for rail. Imagine why Houston might have gotten that. Politically powerful states get lots and lots of federal dollars. And with Salt Lake sporting the Olympics, the federal government and the people around that state had lots of reason to make sure dollars went to the right places to help that happen. We need to spend those federal dollars more carefully, and they're not being spent more carefully. That will change how our communities can operate in the future. Mr. Richens, I would be so delighted to have you on my council. If only you had moved a couple of miles to the west, you would have found yourself in Tempe, which has a robust mass transit system that not only includes arterial street buses that run more frequently than they do in Mesa, but we also have every place north of the US 60, the Orbit system, which is the blue van system that has no charge to it. It's not free, as some people in the audience would recognize, but what it does is supply every household within the half of Tempe that is most densely populated with a transportation system that allows everyone to avoid using their automobiles precisely because we want to reduce congestion and the time people spend in automobiles.
I think we're moving a little beyond the libertarian question.
Well,
here
no,
as well.
is there pushback? But you didn't get answers about that question from either of the two panelists, so I object to your objection. But the answer is yes, there will be pushback, but does that mean we shouldn't do it? No.
Let's move to the next question. The lady in the back, please. There's a microphone. Please say your name and your affiliation.
You won't let me take the microphone. Hi, I'm Sandy Barr. I'm the chapter director for the Sierra Club here in Arizona. And, well, I had just a quick comment. One, Tempe does have de facto growth boundaries, so that is something I think important to note and something that has been on the table as a tool in the past. But I wanted to mention the subsidies, because the subsidies, I think, are a huge issue relative to why we continue to see urban sprawl and at the rate we do here. And they're so built into everything that people don't see them as subsidies anymore. And so I would ask, how can we better expose those subsidies and shift them into helping to do things that will make our communities more sustainable and do all the things that we would like to do, including protecting state trust lands, as well as having more compact development with mixed-use zoning and supporting a mass transit system. So I'm just wondering how we can better expose those subsidies. And then just one other quick thing, because she won't give me this microphone back, I know, after I give it to her, is on the state trust land issue. I mean, we've worked on state trust land conservation, and I think it's important to look at the reform, But I think we also need to be very careful because we do have 9.3 million acres of state trust land. The only reason we have 9.3 million acres of state trust land is because the Constitution and the Enabling Act are very tight. Land speculators would have had their hands on those a long time ago in Arizona's environment without that. And so as we move forward, I think we need to really think about that. So thank you.
On Sandy's first question, Sandy, I would say monetize the subsidies. Mary Jo Pitzel's piece the other day about the dollar consequences of the exemptions to the sales tax is a pretty powerful way to express that. It's easy to monetize all of these. Monetize them if they're tax breaks, monetize them if they're subsidies, and find a way to make sure that's a clear understanding, and everybody who's paying attention at least to these public policy decisions knows what they are.
I'm sorry, I got to jump in because at this panel we've heard both the word monetize and the word fungible, which you would never hear. This is clearly an august body, and Dr. Kaur is exactly right, but when we start talking about monetizing, people ask, what on earth are you saying? It is figure out what the dollar value is to something. You want to know the biggest subsidy that developers get? The change in zoning they seek to go from agricultural to single-family owner-occupied, or from small 35-foot limit development to 40 stories. That's monetized very easily because you can see what the transactions price is for agricultural land versus land that's been zoned and has all of its, quote, entitlements. And every single time a municipality sprinkles entitlements on a piece of property, the value of it goes up precipitously, and somebody made a lot of money. And it wasn't the taxpayer whose representatives made that choice to change the zoning. Their campaign coffers often reflect that they were incentivized to make that change. And if you want to check it out, go look at municipal officers' campaign finance reports. You'll find development zoning lawyers, development zoning lawyers, architects, and all of the developers around the state.
Let me just contradict you a tiny bit.
Okay,
here,
a tiny bit.
Okay,
be careful.
No, it's okay. One of the issues we have in developing the central corridor is the fact that the city of Phoenix put an overlay zoning on that. We have a very, very low property tax rate, okay? And we created this thing that people perceive to be valuable, which is a high-rise overlay. And as a consequence, the landowners, the people that own this person, sit there and go, I'm going to wait till it happens. We cannot incentivize them enough to sell the land and convert it to what's really feasible, which is not high-rise.
That's right, but we saw that 40 years ago, and you were in college when that occurred. We saw the very same thing happen across Apache Boulevard. It's called upzoning. And municipalities misunderstand that they can drive development in a blanket way by saying, I'm going to upzone all of this property. So Apache Boulevard languished for 40 years because my previous development staff said, you know what, the low-density housing and small commercial businesses aren't what we want there. We're going to wave a magic wand and put in massive development opportunity, and you got speculation. And Phoenix did exactly the same thing with this land grant gift to a bunch of people who didn't ask for it.
Right.
I agree.
agree.
That's why you now have speculation.
Right, and now you can't take it away.
Now you can't take it away because then it's a taking.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
And
the federal
maybe
Constitution
30
protects
years
that.
before we have a building in downtown Phoenix to clear up.
That's correct.
But one more thing about, I'm going to go back to the pushback for a minute. Okay, if you're a developer and you walk into a community and you ask for zoning for multifamily, you're going to be hung and quartered.
Not in Tempe?
Not in Tempe. But
Tempe's a very small place.
Tempe's a very small
wait a minute.
component.
Everybody knows where Tempe is. You got the mayor of the city of Tempe sitting here. Why is that? This 42.5 square mile, 165,000 person community of 3.6 million people in this county. Why is that? Because we have stayed the course in many ways. We've made lots of mistakes, but the unusual thing, the horrible thing that I've had the Business Journal call, aren't you worried about speculation in multifamily? No. We don't subsidize it, but we do allow it. And as a result, more than 45% of Tempe's housing stock is multifamily. The home ownership rate in the state of Arizona is 68%. In the city of Tempe, it's 49%. Why is that? because we do have transitory folks coming in and out, but we also have people who realize from this last boom and bust that real estate isn't a very secure investment for their retirement, and that they're going to put their money in something else, and maybe instead of owning, they'll rent. And that's what we see.
Let's move on to the next question. I think the here in the red jacket.
Yeah, of course. Molly Castellazzo, and I'm with Homeowner 101, and we're a new organization that helps underwater homeowners understand what are their options and what are the implications of decisions they might make. And, you know, we've talked about, the panel has talked about developers and policymakers and sticks and blocks, but it all comes down to the people who live in these homes, to the homeowners. And, you know, you all have also talked about generations of mistakes, and I think homeowners, real estate agents, developers, we've all made mistakes, certainly. But how do we move on from here, given the fact that, you know, nothing's really going to change unless folks in Arizona can sell their homes and move somewhere else, unless folks in California and Florida and Michigan can sell their homes and move here, then none of this is going to change at all. And I think it was Dave that mentioned, you know, the fact that banks, or that investors rather, are disincentivized from making it easier for homeowners to do that, to reduce principal and to be able to sell. So given the fact that at least 50% on average of homeowners in Arizona are underwater pretty significantly, what can be done? How can we get to a different place than where we're at right now?
Well, a couple of things. One of them is there are things that are outside of the control of the local community, because the primary capital that's driven those opportunities for those homeowners isn't controlled here, okay? You created a system that's not easily unwound anymore because of the servicers, because we've got collateralized mortgage-backed securities. They've been sliced and diced and sent off, and you got lots of people in the decision-making process. It's unfortunate. I think one of the things, we have to do two things. One of them is nothing solves this problem better than a economy that continually increases the value of the homes, okay? And then they're not underwater anymore. That's going to happen when we have sustained job growth, okay? And so there's no substitute right now for a very solid, well-run economic development policy. That's one thing we have to have. The other thing we have to have is we've got to make sure that we don't have these problems occur again. And you know, we need to encourage our Attorney General to not just agree to a global settlement with the big banks, okay? This entire problem has not been fully vetted. And until it's fully vetted, we can't put in place the correct changes so that this doesn't happen again.
I have developers come to me all the time. I need to change this project that you guys entitled 3 years ago. It's just not going to work financially. And I, as a public official, I can't protect developers from their own stupid decisions. And just like I can't protect homeowners from spending all the equity in their home and being upside in their houses. And not all homeowners did that, but some people are just going to have to hang in there. They're just going to have to hang in there in a house. There's no guarantee in the Constitution that your house is going to be worth what you owe on it. You know, it's not an ATM card. And there's some people that are just going to have to hang in there for a while and pay a mortgage that is worth more than their house. And as harsh as that sounds, there needs to be some realization of that. They purchased the home under a set of terms that they're responsible for.
Well, but in the typical case we had in the run-up, people who bought at a certain price and then the house dropped in value, we had a whole lot of people who went out and took second mortgages and refinanced, and as you said, took lots of equity out of their home to buy jet skis. Now, not everybody did that. I'm just puzzled by your question because if somebody's got the home and has not yet abandoned it, they've probably made the economic decision that the price they're paying for the mortgage and interest, which is deductible against federal income taxes, of course, if they're making income, is probably less than what they would likely have to pay to rent something to get them what they need for their family. That's the typical point, because in Arizona, you've got protection against deficiency, so there's a lot of reason to abandon homes where you're not just underwater, but the economic decision you're making is you're now renting essentially your own home. And you may get equity back in it if the market fluctuates. It's not, at the moment at least, likely that it's going to go down, but now you're just a renter. So is this rental that you happen to own and not getting any equity better choice? That's what most people are now with. If the home's not empty, that's not one of our problems. People who are underwater making those decisions. The problems we have are people who can't pay their mortgage because their economics don't allow it, or have chosen not to and are really essentially trying to abandon it. That's another empty home that will or will not get absorbed based on whether Mark's point is made and we understand it. We have to develop the economy. I'm also the chair of the Maricopa Association of Governments. That's all of the municipalities and other organizations within the county. I'm supposed to help us work on transportation infrastructure, social issues, the air quality issues we face. We're about to be shut down by the federal government because the feds don't understand that dust blows in the desert where there's ambient dust. And when we have 101 events this last year due to dust storms and haboobs, I say that because it gets out the word that a haboob is a huge dust storm, federal government. Understand that. Let me just show you a picture instead of spending 487 work days of employees to document that a dust storm came through. With that said, I'm sorry, the moderator is going to cut me off. The point is, at the Maricopa County Association of Governments, we're now working to try to bring everybody together. The GPEX, the East Valley Partnership, the West Valley Westmark, the new Commerce Authority, with MAG, and bring those agencies together to work on developing what are the niches that we can get to grow this economy. Because if we have an underlying growing economy, those houses will be absorbed. Resale pricing for houses will start to rise. People will be bailed out by a growing economy, and that's maybe one of the most powerful things we can do is help the private sector to grow. Government doesn't create a lot of jobs, but it certainly can help the private sector creating jobs by doing things that move the economy forward, reducing the kinds of foolish things we do that make it harder. Municipalities are some of our worst enemies. The city of Phoenix is right now cutting its own throat on development because its development services department has gotten a reputation of being one of the most difficult to work with in the state.
Let's focus on growing the economy. And I also want to get to, you had a question in the back here in the striped shirt.
Well, before he gives us a question,
Hi,
you need to realize that a haboob is an attack by a zombie subdivision. Okay, so
Maricopa
there's a connection here.
Okay, I didn't realize that, yes, okay.
Hi, Stephen Gubrud, Arizona State University. She touched on the growth boundary of Tempe a little bit earlier, and I just want to expand upon it. And I heard Mark say earlier when they were talking about the demographics changing. He said that the fringe development was going to be, was going to increase no matter what. There's no specific way to stop it. I just feel that how could we possibly, change this without a policy change? And I research at the Phoenix Urban Research Lab, and in Uptown and Midtown Phoenix, there's a handful of new developments, that have been happening in the last 10 years, and 75% of these are multi-family homes, and 25% of the whole 100 total are renovations and major overhauls of these buildings that are going on. Now, at the same time, dirt cheap priced homes are abundant on the outskirts of our metro area and in the Phoenix-Tucson corridor. And I feel as though money will certainly beat demographics in this case because, if there's not that much expansion going on inside the city and there's such dirt cheap expansion going on the outskirts, how can that not possibly be so? So at the risk of being labeled granola, I have to mention that the Sonoran Desert is the second most biodiverse system in the entire world, right behind the Amazon rainforest. And they have a model in Portland where there is an expansion boundary. And I was wondering, how is it possible that we can't implement this type of expansion boundary in the Phoenix to Tucson corridor? Is it simply because they're bickering? The bickering municipalities and policy, or is it, something other than this? Because
let's stop with that question right there. The expansion boundary. We've said is it politically untenable?
I'm not sure we want it, quite honestly.
It got voted down twice. That's one part of the answer.
Well, it's interesting, Laddie, because you know this. The very fact that it was raised as a issue on the ballot exacerbated the expansion, in particular into the East Valley. Okay, there were 100.
Beat the regulation.
Beat the regulation. Okay, the number of plats recorded in Pinal County was staggering, okay? And that set up this incredible flow across county lines, which was really driven by two things. Increasing land price, okay? A public policy that decreased the minimum lot size of lots in Queen Creek, Gilbert, and Chandler, okay? And I don't think Mesa participated in that.
They'd already rezoned all their commercial industrial to residential.
And an increase in the impact fees, essentially, that those communities imparted. And as a result of doing that, the developers jumped the county line in order to keep affordable housing. If you put a growth boundary around this community, you're going to have an exacerbated situation with affordable housing, okay? A couple things that are happening is we look at the physical landscape and we don't see the geopolitical boundaries, okay? We have growth boundaries. It's the national forest, it's the Indian reservations, okay? And although they're not intended to be, we have state trust lands, which greatly, to your point before, impact the development patterns we have, okay? But we are running out of space except along certain corridors, for instance, in the North Valley. You know, we're beginning to bump up against those boundaries. We're creating the Sonoran Preserve. We're creating our own boundaries. This is a very immature metropolitan area.
Post-World War.
Post-World War, very immature. So we're seeing a development pattern that's going to have the effect of having growth boundaries without actually having to have them. Now, there's other issues we have to deal with because we've got another county outside of your purview. We have many jurisdictions.
Outside my purview, really, but.
What's it? Well, me
Pinal
too.
County.
Pinal County, right? And so there's a whole different development issue there. The Sun Corridor.
Yeah, you still have to go back to deal with this problem of having over 600,000 entitled lots in Pinal County, in a county of 328,000 people.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, that's the number. Over 600,000 lots. What do you do with that? How do you come back from the brink on that one? It's already bladed and platted, and some of them have roads, some of them have some infrastructure in them, and that's why, you know, I say tongue-in-cheek, a haboob is attacking the city. It's from a zombie subdivision. It's a lot of that's true. We've disturbed that crust of the desert, and it gets kicked right up, and that's why you had these happen this year.
You know, Dave, I'm going to just add one thing for people here, because this is what's going to happen likely. Look at the basic land economics, okay? You've got all of those lots in Pinal County, right? And they're relatively small lots, okay? They're not big lots, relatively small. That land today is selling at farm values. So it's selling between $6,000 and $10,000 an acre. Okay?
Farm values are up.
And farm values are up, right? And so when you look at what the platted and engineered price of a lot is in Pinal County, it's really, really, really small, okay? So now what you're faced with is the cost of actually developing. When the market starts to come back, that's the cheapest land to develop, okay? People are going to jump there. And that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to continue this pattern.
Live there.
And then, like Anthem, they're going to demand freeways be built.
That's exactly right. Well, look at the Sun Corridor. It's quicker to go from Coolidge over to I-10 and up than it is to go from parts of the Southeast Valley right now.
I want to move on to this side of the table. We've got a couple hands up, or this side of the room, rather.
Social science PhD student at ASU, and So we've heard a lot of talk tonight about development and sprawl, and I want to return specifically to a moment where someone said that, you know, we should think about the way that the development was happening in this city in the 1920s and 30s. But in the 1920s and 30s, Phoenix had some of the worst slums in the country, which is a pattern of social and environmental inequity that we've seen perpetuated through time and that we still see today. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about, you know, new economic forms and all these lovely visions of infill and greening and sustainability, what can we do to make sure that those visions are inclusive of places like South Phoenix, where we have, you know, the highest levels of federally regulated toxic facilities, criteria air pollutants, and an intensifying urban heat island problem?
Well, I come from the University of Chicago, if that was directed at me, which I think it was, looking at how we developed We have moved away, thankfully, from one thing that assured that the city of Phoenix would end up with slums beginning in the 1920s, and the same pattern started in Tempe and other cities. In the city of Tempe, Spanish was the primary language spoken through the 1920s, or the mid-1920s, and our population was relatively peaceful, and Tempe is the merger of Hayden's Ferry and San Pablo, two small communities. But racism began to really develop here in the 1920s and carried forward in a way that assured that by segregating our population and segregating our opportunities, we would also end up with folks who were subject to fewer opportunities for economic development. And we saw that pattern happen in Tempe. We saw it happen in Phoenix in particular, to some degree in Mesa as well. We certainly saw it in the major cities across the country that are east of the Mississippi. Those patterns, I think, are starting to break down in our social systems, and we're seeing redevelopment in those areas as well. I can't make up for the fact that through zoning and those kinds of choices, the city of Phoenix put more hazardous waste materials manufacturers south of the river, but that was not an unusual choice for communities to make, that they would segregate to lesser valued lands the kinds of uses that might ultimately contaminate that land. Those are free rider problems. They're moral hazard problems that you put on somebody you don't like or properties you don't value, the costs of doing business by allowing contamination to take place without making the person who contaminates clean it up. We face that same problem in Tempe with a former county island that is now Tempe Marketplace. Some people complained about a subsidy to get that done, except that the federal government and state government and local governments, the county, had allowed pollution to take place, and that was a subsidy to the people who polluted.
But in this future wave of growth, I mean, are we talking about, are we likely to see these same sorts of the minority groups, the lower income classes, likely to fall behind? When we talk about the future of growth in Arizona, are we leaving them behind?
What you're likely seeing as those who are economically more challenged, they're going to continue to find spaces where they can find the cheapest cost of housing plus the cost of transportation. And that's a typical pattern. So when transportation systems are built and housing stocks are older, folks with lesser means end up living there. That's why we saw huge growth in, sorry, Dr. Kaur, but student population in Tempe's older housing stocks, because the city's oldest housing stock, the single-family, otherwise owner-occupied housing stock, was a very cheap alternative to expensive university housing, and that continued for a couple of decades. The university went from 25,000 to 50,000 people without building more than, I think, about 800 housing units, and that pushed a lot of students into our market, which actually helped save a lot of property owners. There was a subsidy there by the state not capturing those students on the campus. Now there's an ugly element of that, and that is single-family 3-bedroom homes are turned into 6-member dormitories, and 4-bedroom homes are turned into 8-person dormitories with a lot of deleterious effects that are free rider problems. Those students get to live a life that they like to live, but undermine the otherwise single-family kind of owner-occupied lifestyle. Do we have a lot of housing stock in Tempe that is for lesser well-off people? Yeah, in fact, Tempe has the most diverse housing stock in the state. But that doesn't mean we have slum neighborhoods. What it means is that older parts of our community have sprinkled throughout people of modest means, and they're living right alongside folks who spent lots and lots of money to refurbish 1925-year-old brick houses.
Let me bring this conversation into education, if I can, for a minute, because I think educating this population will be really critical to getting our economy moving in a fair and just way. Dr. Glasper or Dr. Bustamante, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think education is part of the key, and I've been sitting here trying to listen to the discussions around the sprawl, and one of the things that we're looking at right now and have been trying to implement for at least 5 to 7 years is this notion of empowerment zones. And Rio is one of the leaders in our district in terms of empowerment zones. And the empowerment zones are trying to work within this notion of this 1 mile, 1 square mile, but most of our colleges serve like a 6-mile concentric circle, and they're starting to overlap. But when you think about an empowerment zone, where the education comes in is that in most of these empowerment zones, which fall within the sectors you were talking about, there's a local elementary school, there's a high school, and there's a community college. And as we start looking at bringing in a close university, whether public or private, and community-based agencies, I think you will begin to address a number of the issues relative to the sprawl and have within a reasonable location an opportunity for people to go to school, to have recreation and others within that empowerment zone circle. When I look at other areas of growth within our valley and extended within other counties, I can see the notion of trying to have education there, but when you try to provide them with the full service complementary type of commitment, then the cost is going to spiral exponentially. And given the environment that we're in now, I like the conversations about moving back to the notions of filling in the spaces where we have and providing services and utilizing both public, private, and enterprise zones and community-based agencies as one entity. I think you can save costs. I think you can share business costs. You can share faculty. You can share other kinds of costs where now we're trying to be independent in silos, and it's causing to the individual sprawl throughout our county and throughout our state.
Yes, sir. In the back.
As they take the microphone, I wanted to comment a little bit on the PhD student also.
Sure, please.
One of the things I marvel about America is our ability to technologically innovate ourselves out of our worst problems. And there's a lot of things that are different now than there were 100 years ago. There's some marvelous, sewer systems and water systems that work pretty well. And I think even our worst housing, there's some bad housing stock out there, but even our worst housing stock in comparison internationally is pretty darn good. We have some older stuff in West Mesa that we've been trying to deal with, but even the worst of our fourplex problem is got pretty sound roofs, running water, a place for a big screen TV. So in comparison, toilets that flush. So I think there needs to be some acknowledgement to the American system and how we've been able to technologically innovate in America.
If I can add that, I think part of the social injustice issue here isn't necessarily the housing stock. It's accessibility to quality food because of how development patterns have emerged, where you have less access to the kinds of services that you need. So healthcare and quality food are two of the things that become very difficult for people in these areas that have become physically obsolete. And if you don't have adequate transportation systems and you have declining family and household incomes, you lose retailers. And then you're forced to deal with alternatives that are not as healthy for you. I think that's a bigger issue in my view than the housing stock itself.
I would add to that the quality of K-12 education. It has the greatest single variance across communities and in many ways is a far more serious problem in low-income communities than housing stock. I'm a proud resident of South Phoenix, and I have watched the efforts to turn Roosevelt School District into a performing school. It is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and it is one of the costs to people who are living there in terms of their opportunity for the future.
Dr. Coors hit it, I think, on the head in terms of the social justice issue. We heavily subsidize education in this country, and we don't do it very well. While other titles were introduced here, I happen to be the principal of a public school. It's a 6th grade through 12th grade school. And the model, I think, that's been created demonstrates the right way to do it that we've lost, and that is this neighborhood notion. Sadly, one of the saddest things I've seen in what's happened to Tempe, and it's happened all around us in this valley, is that school districts have gone from neighborhood schools to larger and larger schools, just like the private sector went from small local groceries and hardware stores to supercenters, subsidized because of that zoning change. Then we all cut our own throats by saving a few dollars here and going to the giant center, and then complain that our strip mall neighborhood store isn't there when we, quote, need it, unquote. Well, we've done the same thing with our neighborhood schools. We decided that it was cheaper to put more kids into larger buildings, not even talking about classroom size, but instead of having 500 students who are from the neighborhood and creating that neighborhood connection and maintaining that over time, what we did was cram 1,500 students into a collector school for middle school, elementary, and then ultimately 5,000 students at the high school. And by destroying those neighborhood connections, we lost community. And worse, we have made it very difficult to educate students properly. And so we are now guaranteeing every student a mediocre education precisely because we saw value as the same thing as expense or cost. And the marginal cost to us of maintaining neighborhood schools was small relative to the savings we had in creating these behemoths. And now we've lost our neighborhood schools, we've lost the neighborhood connections, and we've lost our ability to teach children well. Roosevelt School is going through a process to try to improve its education. The superintendent there is fabulous, but it's going to be one of the roughest roads to go down to fix this problem. And I think it requires going back to the model of the neighborhood school that will give us very direct connection between teacher and student, principal, teacher and student, and families and students within that neighborhood. That will, I think, help us educate better and ultimately give people better choices in job opportunities that will help grow the economy and grow their families' lives and futures.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Sir, I'm going to get you and then Devin Brown.
My name is Peter Newton, and I'm involved with the American Institute of Architects and the U.S. Green Building Council here in Arizona. My question comes more to as Laddie Kaur knows, and many of you others do, I mean, Laddie probably worked with him when he was at Washington University, we don't really have as many August Bushes or long-standing groups like the Danforth, long-standing institutions and families that have kind of a concerned interest in the city, at least not that I've seen yet. And older cities have reinvented themselves because you had institutions and economic value coming from people saying, hey, this is our hometown, we help build this economy, we want to invest. All of our local banks, the Bimsons, the Valley National Bank has been bought out, the local stores have been bought out. And when you look at development in the Valley now, when it's all outside money having to come in and they're looking at where their quick speculative gain is coming out, and they see that along the 101 or perhaps the 303, 404, whatever number we throw to the next loop road. So how do we create that local wealth that creates that internal community or change that larger vision that books out there are writing very negatively about us to get outside money to come in and help us recreate that vision of what we want?
Your observation about the giants, financial giants and institutional giants of a community not only not being the case here in a relatively new metropolitan area, but actually we've seen, as many cities across the country have, a flight of some of our locally owned businesses over the last 20 years. The newspaper, the banks, the basic institutions there. In fact, the utilities are about the only, utilities and the colleges and universities are about the only ones that have remained strictly local. It's a little more intense here because we didn't have the legacy. But even in cities that had a long history of this kind of powerful set of institutions, I lived in St. Louis for close to 2 decades, had 15 multinational corporate headquarters there, had Gussie Bush and others that you described. They were a significant anchor, but even they are seeing the kind of dissipation of that presence. The answer, I believe, just as the answer for the kind of economic development we want to have for the future is to grow our own, to grow it, to create the environment where ideas and talent can find a way through a series of the activities that fortunately are underway now in the accelerators and in the incubators and in the college and university world here to make it happen. We have to grow our own institutions in the community. It's been interesting, not the answer to it all, but it's an example, I think, of value. It's been interesting to watch the foundations begin to gain an identity in Arizona. When I came back to Arizona, my native state, 20 years ago, there weren't many. There was the Flynn Foundation doing some important work. There were other pieces of it. But today there are some very significant ones, not as large as those in Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, but gaining in strength and stature, including the Arizona Community Foundation, which is made up of investors from all over the state. And I think they serve as the kind of local anchor on which we can build. But we have other institutions we can treasure. Rufus's College is here. It's one of the great systems in America. Everyone around the world knows it. The universities are the new universities that are coming in. Don't forget we have one of the largest in the world in the University of Phoenix, Apollo, others that are part of it. Those are institutions that can also be part of the solid base. And the political culture that Mayor Hallman and others have talked about, that can grow as well with an identity that makes it sufficiently strong that we can rally around it. One of the reasons our center has turned so much to local communities in trying to think through how to activate the Arizona we want for the future is that there's immense energy and strength there. And there's also a lot of reward for the people who get involved, not only seeing success themselves, but meeting others and working with others and beginning to create that kind of identity that Hugh Hallman just described a moment ago.
Thank you. Devin Brown, please.
Backpacks on that. Thanks. I'm Devin Brown. I'm one of the reporters here at the station. I worked on the Beyond Sprawl series. This question's for the mayor. I know that Arizona has a recent history of attracting businesses that like to set up on the periphery, right? Call centers and warehouses and tract homes and things. But Tempe tried to do something different in 2006, right, when it attracted Google to its downtown, but it didn't work, and they packed up and left. And I wanted to know if you had some lessons learned from that on how, if we are going towards new economies outside of these C's, that famous voice, that was my soundbite.
But I think chip plants are actually a success, not a failure. So when somebody lumps in chip manufacturing as a failure, I think that's a mistake, and that's why.
I don't think he was saying it was a failure. I think he was just sort of making a point that we moved from one group of 5 C's to other C's, and I'm just trying to.
Cotton, copper, citrus, climate, and what have I missed? Cattle. And now we're call centers and construction, which I don't think are particularly sustainable.
Well, what I want to know from you is how we can retain Arizona's talent.
How did we fail with Google? Why did the state of Arizona fail with Google? And why will we continue to face that challenge? Google selected its location based on its desire to get engineering students from Arizona State University. It did not get the kinds of students it wanted into its doors at the price it was offering. So it didn't get the flow that it thought it would get at a price that it made sense. It also has changed its model. So it didn't close up just the Tempe office. It closed up a whole host of satellite offices like that and decided that that wasn't the direction they wanted to go or try to make their success pattern. But with that said, there are lots of examples of successes in the Valley, and what I think we have to do to get better success is stop competing against one another for those opportunities. The announcement of the Silicon Valley Bank, I think, is a game changer for us, and people look at me and say, who cares, it's another bank. It isn't just another bank. It's an institution whose investment portfolio has 40 some odd clients already here in the Valley that are high-tech driven, and they are investment bankers making investments based on technology that they think is going to hit. They have investments across the globe. They're one of the largest tech investors, and that they decided to put an office here that'll employ up to 200 people should tell us all that their decision-making is like lots of companies' decision-making. They want a good quality of life for their employees with a good education system and an opportunity for success. Arizona is a modest regulatory state. It's got a low cost of living unless you start adding in automobiles and you have to transport yourself from the far west side or far east side. So they happen to be typically companies that look more like Dave Richen's point about what the future demographics is going to look like. And we'll see those companies land in this valley because the infrastructure is well built out. We have a freeway system that is relatively uncongested compared to larger areas. So you can still live pretty far out from the urban environment if you want a single-family home like Mr. Richens does with a picket fence and a dog and 4 kids in the yard. You need that kind of space when you have a family. But many people are making different choices now. We now, I think, have the inventory of real estate for commercial and industrial. We have the inventory for residential that will be a cheap, inexpensive alternative for companies to choose this valley. And we happen to be at the edge of the new economy as it's going forward. So as companies make decisions, it's not going to be old, cold manufacturing companies. It's folks who are opening new kinds of businesses.
We are essentially out of time, and so I just want to ask...
Imagine that.
A final question here. Go back to what you were saying about Google. You said they didn't have the engineers they needed.
At the price they wanted to
At
pay.
the price they wanted. Laddie Kaur, your poll said that young people are not confident they'll have the creative jobs that they want. We are underperforming educationally when you compare us to Denver, to Colorado Springs. We have this huge, massive university system. Google was looking for educated engineers, but the price was wrong. But there was so many people there. What have we done wrong?
Were they not paying enough, Hugh?
They were not paying enough compared to what students at that time, graduating at that time, thought they could grab in the market. They had this inflated idea of what the economy trajectory was going to be, just like housing developers did on the faux number of housing units that were being purchased by people who didn't have tenants. Just like lots of people in cities and the state government set their budgets based on this trajectory that was completely unsustainable. 22% growth is not sustainable. And that's what so many people counted on for the next year and the next year. And when it collapsed, the students who turned up their nose at Google and would now die for a job at Google at the price they were offering can't get it. And that's what happened. And that was the story of inflated expectations that were not supported by reality. And when that occurs, you have a market crash across the board, and that's what we saw for students, for homeowners, for banks, for businesses across the board.
Thank you very much. Our evening has come to a close. This town hall, Beyond Sprawl, was a production of KJZZ's Changing America desk and the Public Insight Network. Special thanks to Annette Flores, who carried the load of planning this event. Thanks to MCTV, Rio Salado College, and our panel of experts. Dave Richens of the Sonoran Institute, Tempe Mayor Hugh Hallman, Laddie Kaur, CEO and President of the Center of the Future for Arizona, and Mark Stapp with the W.P. Carey School of Business at ASU. Thank you to Dr. Glasper and Dr. Bustamante as well. And thanks, of course, to you, our audience. I'm KJZZ News Director Peter O'Dowd. Have a wonderful night.